Howdy folks, this is Big Sam. Today, we're going to be doing one of our most highly requested videos of all time. That's right, y'all have been asking for it for ages. There have been countless Reddit and random internet forum posts throughout the ages about this topic. That's right, we're going to be talking today about the legendary and very mysterious 7.62 by 53 millimeter cartridge. So let's get into it, folks. Now, first off, some of y'all who aren't familiar with this cartridge probably thought I misspoke. You might say, Big Sam, I know there's a 7.62 by 54 rimmed cartridge. What is 7.62 by 53 rimmed cartridge, though? And this is where things get really interesting, because we all know, or most of us know, that Finland used Mosins very heavily from the Finnish Civil War, going on from 1918 all the way up through the end of the Continuation and Lapland War in the mid-1940s. So they have a very rich history of the Mosin rifle. And with that comes a plethora of interesting variants, like this M24 Civil Guard rifle, whose barrel was actually produced by SIG, which is pretty cool. But one of the things we need to talk about is the whole process of how Finland went about deciding how they were going to use Mosin rifles, and in what capacity, and in what ways they were actually able to. So after the Finnish Civil War, Finland had a lot of Mosins in their armories. They had a ton of Mosins from armories that were kind of left over from the whole of the old Russian Empire, because Finland, before 1918, was actually part of the Russian Empire. The Tsar actually acted as the Grand Duke of Finland. It was kind of this weird relationship. But anyway, once the Finnish Civil War was over and the Finnish whites had successfully won and declared their independence, they had a lot of Mosins laying around from the old Russian Empire, but also they had a lot of Mosins that were gifted to them by the Germans around 1918. A lot of those Mosins were, of course, ones that the Germans had captured from the Russians in the first several years of the war, the Great War. So you ended up having this weird scenario where you have all of these interesting different Mosins kind of funneling into this newly formed Nordic country, which was Finland at the time. There was a problem, though. There are actually a couple problems. One, a lot of these guns were really beat up. They really weren't taken super good care of, most of them. So a lot of those, the barrels on these things were pretty dubious at best. They were kind of shot out. They had a lot of pitting. They weren't stored super well. And in general, they were just worn. They had seen better days. They'd seen a lot of field use. And they had a lot of rounds put through them. And so what you had was this sort of nightmare scenario for Finland, because they also had a problem of not really having a whole lot of money to do anything about it. They didn't have a huge budget. I mean, Finland was still a mostly agrarian society. So when they started thinking about, okay, how are we going to consolidate our arms into, some standardized new infantry weapon, they ran into some problems and some disagreements along the way, as you might imagine. So obviously the solution here on all of these guns, I mean, I've read reports that, up to maybe 100,000 or even more, at least close to that, needed new barrels, which is not good if you don't have the funds to do anything like that. And we talked about this a little bit going back into our video we did on the P series. So if you're not interested in the P series, we did like a whole hour documentary on that thing. So I'd encourage you to take a look at that for a little bit more info. But essentially, what it boiled down to was Finland, using a couple different techniques, tried to rebarrel at least some of their rifles, the ones that like really needed it the most, at least, right? I mean, that's the one you start out with. If you can't rebarrel them all, start out with the absolute worst of the worst, ones that basically you couldn't hit the broadside of a barn with, or had no confidence issuing to any type of troops. That type of thing, essentially. Maybe even ones that had damage to the barrel. Maybe there was a bulge in it, or it was, you know, shot or something. Who knows? But a lot of these types of guns were obviously the first candidates for guinea pigs. Now, Finland also didn't have a lot of workshops for mass producing new barrels, and they didn't have a lot of money to do it. And so one of the first things they ended up trying was, of course, as I mentioned previously, the P series, which was basically using the old Italian Salerno method developed by Giuseppe Salerno, which was originally designed to take a rifle with a larger diameter, like the 10mm Vetterli rifle, and put a sleeve in it so that it could accept a smaller diameter cartridge, the 6.5 Carcano cartridge. Finland then decided, well, we're going to try to do that, but we're going to instead take that principle and use it to reline an existing barrel for the same caliber, kind of the same caliber. You can probably see where this is going. This is one of the things that they tried. Ultimately, you've probably heard of the Tikkakoski factory. The Tikkakoski factory was actually really the first successful factory at mass producing barrels in Finland on any scale. They really started right about the tail end of 1925, and from then on, the rest is history, as we know. They went on to produce a lot of barrels, and ultimately after them, they'd be followed by the Sacco factory and the VKT factory, who would start producing barrels as well, as the budget really allowed. Obviously, Finland wasn't able to rebarrel as many Mosins as they liked, so it's really easy to go find a Finnish Mosin, like one of these, that's just really worn. I mean, ironically, this one's really, really worn, and it was rebarreled by Finland. So these things had a lot of use. But what about the cartridges, right? We talked a lot about their history so far, but what about the cartridges? Well, you see, as Finland was developing this whole process of relining and making new barrels, essentially the same thing from the bullet's point of view. It's a new barrel, whether it's a new barrel or it's relined. One of the big problems with the Russian Mosin Nagants was that the bore diameters weren't always consistent. Let's just be nice and put it that way. Now, this is probably due to a few reasons. One, let's face it, the tolerances on Mosins in general, not just the barrel, but in general, have always been a little bit on the lenient side. Let's just put it that way. Some things were considered a little bit more acceptable in Russia than other countries from a weapons tolerance standpoint. In certain aspects. I mean, generally they were totally safe to shoot, but when we talk about tolerances of maybe bore diameters, for instance, they tended to vary probably a lot more than some other countries' infantry rifles did. And so this would actually remain true up until, World War II. So really any Russian Mosin up until World War II, you could have, you could look at it and the bore diameter could be, anywhere from like 310 to 314, maybe even more. I mean, that's quite a significant deviation. There's a lot of variance. Now, why is this important? Well, one of the things Finland was really focused on, much more so than probably most countries, was accuracy. And if you want a good, accurate rifle, you need two things. You need a good bullet, okay? And then you need a rifle to put said bullet in. Now, you can spend, tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars or whatever currency you have to develop a really optimal bullet. But the problem is, if you have a bunch of rifles that have different bore diameters, it's kind of a waste because a lot of those bore diameters are probably going to end up being either too small for the thing, which can cause issues, or it could be too large for the thing, which also can cause many issues, different issues, either way. And so this was kind of what Finland found is in the 1920s, they really started developing a new cartridge called 7.62 by 53 because they were interested in their own ammunition that they had better control of the tolerances of and something that would shoot better in rifles. And so what is the 7.62 by 53 rimmed cartridge? That's a good question. And I appreciate you bearing with me so far. So if you take a look at this picture over here, you'll see there's two different comparisons. You'll see a cartridge on the left and a cartridge on the right. Now, the cartridge on the left is the 7.62 by 53 millimeter cartridge, and the cartridge on the right next to it is the 7.62 by 54 millimeter rimmed cartridge. And right away, you're going to notice there's a difference. One of the difference is the neck length of the 54 millimeter cartridge is longer than the neck length of the 53 millimeter cartridge. Why is that important? Well, if your neck length is shorter in the 53 cartridge, there's a very good chance that, assuming you really did your chamber reaming correctly, and depending on the throat and everything else and how everything else is done, you might not even be able to chamber a 54 millimeter cartridge. You might not be able to. I think you can see how this is going to be a fun problem. The other interesting thing about this, though, is that the 53 millimeter rimmed cartridge was actually utilizing a 308 diameter projectile. That's right. Whereas the 54 tended to use a little bit heavier, or a little bit bigger, wider, I guess I should say. Generally, we're talking about 311 to 312. It'll depend on the bullet, but that's generally where I would say it averages about 311 or 312 diameter. So a little bit smaller in diameter bullet. This is going to get fun, folks. So Finland said that's the cartridge we're going to standardize on. And so as you would start seeing barrels produced in Finland, generally speaking, you would expect them to actually be chambered for the 7.62 by 53 millimeter cartridge. Probably. Again, this is the idea. I'm not saying every single one in the 1920s and 30s, every single barrel that they produced was chambered in this, but it's probably most likely to. So, for instance, this rifle here, which is a Finnish M24 Civil Guard rifle, had a barrel produced by the SIG factory, which we're not going to get into all the specifics of all the different Mosin variants today. That this video is already going to be too long as it is, folks. But this guy is most likely in that 7.62 by 53 millimeter category with a 308 diameter bore. Although it's going to get a little bit interesting because I have actually shot standard commercial 7.62 by 54 through this gun. We're going to get into that more a little bit later, though, and because I know one of the questions that I get a lot is, can I shoot 7.62 by 54 millimeter cartridges in Finnish Mosins that have a 308 diameter bore and are chambered in 7.62 by 53? We're going to get into that, folks. Okay, so Finland starts out with this new caliber, right? And the problem is from my perspective as a historian, immediately backed themselves into a corner doing this. Why? Well, one of the big reasons is, remember I was talking about the budget, okay? What we do know is that Finland didn't rebarrel nearly all of their, certainly their M91 rifles. And these are rifles that have already gone through 2 or 3 wars at least over, 30, 40, years, even up to half a century on some of them by the time the Winter War came around. And the continuation wars. So these guns were beat up. And here's the problem. If you have these old guns that you didn't rebarrel, that maybe started out in life with like a 313 diameter bore, and then went through like 30, 40 years of wars and wasn't stored super well, you probably see where this is going. Your barrel's probably going to be opened up a little bit more through all that wear and use. And so you have what you started out with a 14 diameter bore, which is probably no longer that by now, probably a little bit more shot out, and coupled with the fact that now you're standardizing on a 308 diameter bullet. In a situation where you had to use that particular bullet in that particular gun, what's going to happen? Well, it's probably not even going to stabilize in many guns, and you're going to get tumbling. Now, that's not really good, especially if you're looking for accuracy. However, some people probably didn't mind this, especially during the Winter War, if you're shooting at close range, because, well, if you're an attacking Russian in the Winter War, you probably don't want to get hit by a tumbling 308 projectile going at some 2,000 odd feet per second. That's going to mess you up very bad. So really, that just ended up being bad for everybody all around. Now that being said, I have read reports that after the Finnish Civil War, Finland probably had over, I think it was 100 million, it was either 10 or 100 million, I forget. It was many, many millions of captured, essentially, 7.62 by 54 millimeter ammunition, or 7.62 by 54 millimeter ammunition produced by a DWM in Germany. So they certainly had a lot of that old ammo that they could use in those guns. So maybe it was at the end of the world, but at the very least, this is already going to complicate your ammunition supply. I don't really see the point in doing this from this aspect. Now, when we talk about being able to standardize on, all your barrels are they're like really finely tuned to the same diameter, and you're all standardized on the same bullet, and the bullet's optimized for all your guns, that's good. That's really good. But you have to look at the pitfalls and the drawbacks of doing that, and we're going to see there's some drawbacks. One of the other problems, though, is what I mentioned about chambering. Seems like some of these Finnish Mosins that were chambered for 7.62 by 53 millimeter, a lot of them probably couldn't even, at least when they were new, fully chamber Russian ammunition. 7.62 by 54 millimeter ammunition. Some of them probably could, and it seems some of them maybe couldn't. That's further going to complicate your ammunition supply if you can't even chamber the thing. So off the bat, to me, that's kind of a non-starter. That's kind of a big problem, right? And one of the reasons for that, again, is probably due to that neck length is shorter. And so you might have to remount the chamber a little bit more in order to actually be able to fully chamber a cartridge, a standard, Russian cartridge. Maybe. Again, there's some variance here. And this one, interestingly enough, should be in its original configuration, but I can chamber 7.62 by 54 millimeter ammo just fine in this gun. So every Mosin, even Finnish Mosin, they all tend to be a little bit different, okay? We'll get into this a little bit more. So there's a lot of complications and a lot of potential issues that we're going to see around this cartridge, right? Because you've got Finland with these new barrels and then the old stuff, and essentially we're dealing now with two different calibers. You have 7.62 by 53 and 7.62 by 54. So as we go along, we're going to see more Finnish variants come along. So we have the M24. Then we also have the Finnish M28 rifle, which is really the successor to this rifle that the Civil Guard adopted. Then you'd have the M27 rifle, which was really the Finnish Army's first attempt at modernizing the Mosin rifle in really any meaningful capacity, which was minorly successful, I guess. It had some issues, but I think it was a better gun than a lot of people, at least at the time, gave it credit for. And then you have the Finnish M28-30 rifle. And so you have all of these different rifles, but it seems like probably all of them were going to be chambered from the factory in 7.62x53 with a 308 diameter bore, probably. So there's still some variance here, and there's enough questions for me to really be able to tell you that if you want to know what caliber your Finnish Mosin is in, the really only good way to do it is to have a competent gunsmith take a look at it, or you can do what's called slugging your bore. I always recommend having a gunsmith do it because they have to do these types of things all the time, and they are professionals. They have much better opinions than somebody like me. But a gunsmith can definitely tell you what caliber and what bore diameter your Mosin is in. And remember how I was talking earlier about how Russian Mosins would have large deviations in bore diameters. Same thing there. If you have a Russian Mosin, the best way to figure out what bore diameter you have is to have a gunsmith take a look at it, and they can tell you. They can actually do some measurements to see what your bore diameter is. And why is that important? Well, the Mosin, unfortunately, has gotten kind of a bad reputation over the years for being an inaccurate rifle, which is, I mean, it's a lie, generally speaking, but every lie starts with a very small nugget of truth. And the nugget of truth is there are some things that can cause Mosins to be inaccurate. One of them is bedding, which we're not going to talk about today, but if your stock's not bedded well, obviously you're going to have accuracy problems. The other one is bore diameter deviation. If you're trying to shoot a, say, 311 diameter projectile through your Mosin Nagant rifle, however, there is deviation enough to where when it was produced, your bore diameter was actually 313 or 314. You're trying to shoot a projectile that's just too small to be really accurate in your rifle. And what's going to happen? Well, it's not going to be that accurate. Again, even if you don't have a Finnish Mosin, and especially if you want a hand load for your rifle, it's always a good idea to go to a gunsmith because they can tell you what is the optimal bullet diameter for your rifle. And they can tell you if your rifle is safe to shoot. We'll get into that question a little bit later. But I'll tell you what, spoiler alert, I cannot ever tell you if your gun is safe to shoot. Only a gunsmith can do that. But we'll get into the safety question about these, just generally speaking, a little bit later. Okay, so what ends up happening here? Well, around 1936, Finland decided to actually change their cartridge up a little bit, the 7.62x53 millimeter cartridge. How did they do that? Well, in order to understand that, we need to take a look at another rifle. This is the Finnish M39 Ukko-Pekka rifle, affectionately nicknamed after the old Finnish president who was part of the Civil Guard. That would be another story, again, for another day. Why is this rifle important? Well, in 1936, Finland decided they needed a bit of a different cartridge, at least the Finnish army did. And so what they came up with was a bit of a wider diameter bullet. You might have heard of this cartridge before. It utilized the very famous Lapua D166 projectile. Now this would be about a 310 diameter projectile, which was a little bit wider than the 7.62x53 diameter. The projectiles for those can, I've read conflicting reports. It seems like they could vary anywhere from 308 to 309 diameter. But the D166 was a 310 diameter projectile. And it was an extremely long bullet, okay? This immediately caused some problems because in 1936, pretty much all of the Finnish Mosins that at least Finland had rebarreled were all chambered for the 7.62 by 53 millimeter cartridge, as best I can tell. And one of the issues is probably most of those guns could not even chamber the new 7.62 by 53 millimeter cartridge that utilized the D166 projectile because it was so long. So this caused more problems. And so what ended up happening was this cartridge got delayed for a while. Because remember in 1936, this rifle hadn't actually come around yet. The Finnish Army was still accepting new M27 rifles, which again we'll have to talk about another day. But this kept getting delayed, and then by the time the Winter War came around, I think this really helped kind of push this whole project with the M39, because the M39 was really designed as the replacement for the M27, and they decided to use the best parts of the 2830, again, topic for another video, but they used its rear sight for starters, and kind of the whole front sight where you can adjust it with a screw for windage, which is really handy and cool. So they designed this around that D166 projectile, though, a cartridge that utilized that, rather. This was really the first Finnish rifle designed from the ground up to use that. And so, of course, that means that this rifle, the M39, actually has a slightly larger bore diameter than the earlier Finnish Mosins, where those had 308 diameter bores, probably. Have your gunsmith take a look at it. This guy had a 310 diameter bore. So a little bit wider, and that's good because then you can really well accommodate that new cartridge. So this guy was kind of delayed, and then ultimately you wouldn't really see any of these getting delivered until, you know, probably early 1941. So it's kind of funny, you have the 1936 cartridge utilized first in the M39 rifle, and neither of them were even used together until really 1941. So it got delayed, except when it did come around, this caused, well, a lot more problems. In addition to the previous you know, complications, let's say, in the ammunition supply situation between the 7.62 by 53 millimeter cartridge and the 7.62 by 54 millimeter ammunition they had laying around, plus the stuff that they were capturing from the continuation war, kind of caused some issues. It seems to me like some of this ammo probably could be chambered in some rifles, but probably not all of them, as far as I can tell. And obviously that's going to cause some issues. However, when we see the D166 cartridge come around, this would get a lot more complicated because pretty much all the Finnish Civil Guard rifles, and in fact all of the Finnish Army's Mosin rifles that had new barrels, couldn't even really chamber this cartridge. Now that's a problem because since this is, you know, during the continuation war, it's not like you can have your frontline troops just pull their rifles, send them off to a depot to have them, they have their chamber reamed out so that you can actually chamber the new accepted military cartridge. It was sort of done as they were able to. So as rifles were going into depots for repairs or upgrades, one of the things they would typically do is while it was there, it would just have its the chamber adjusted a little bit so it could accept that new D166 cartridge. And when they did that, they would stamp a D on the chamber. So whenever you look at a Finnish Mosin and you see a D on the barrel, that means that it was at a Finnish depot at some point and it had its chamber adjusted to accept the very long 7.62 by 53 millimeter cartridge that utilized the D166 projectile. Okay, now what about all of our older Mosins though? Well, it seems like this further complicated things because not only were the Mosins rebarreled by Finland not able to accept the D166 cartridge, it seems like a lot of Russian barreled Mosins couldn't accept it either, because you will see tons of Russian made Finnish Mosins, whether it was something like a 9130 that Finland captured, or an older M91 that Finland sort of inherited, if you want to put it that way, after the Finnish Civil War. You'll see the D marking on tons of these rifles. So it seems that all of these rifles probably couldn't accept that cartridge either, and they had to be modified. So it does beg the question of why even bother, right? And that's not really a question I am really capable of answering, because obviously this caused a lot of issues. I think Finland was so focused, though, on the pluses of this cartridge that they obviously were willing to accept the drawbacks. And so if they were able to accommodate it, as it kind of seems they were, because Finland is still around, it's its own independent nation still, I guess it kind of worked for them, so that's good. Now, the D166 cartridge is a legendary cartridge, let's say that. In this rifle, the M39 rifle, it is a massively terrifying round to go up against. You can shoot these things out to like 800 yards with iron sights, no problem with that cartridge. It really expands the rifle's capabilities in conjunction with the sights to something that a standard Mosin you'd have a hard time with. But obviously there are a lot of drawbacks. So that kind of helps round out the entire history of the 7.62 by 54 millimeter cartridge and the 7.62 by 53 millimeter cartridge, which started out using anywhere from a 308 to a 309 diameter projectile, and then ultimately with the D166 utilized a 310 diameter projectile. Again, just to recap, pretty much all the Finnish Mosin barrels before the M39 were probably around 308 diameter bore, and then the M39s were around a 310 diameter bore, with all of the Russian stuff being probably anywhere from 311 to 313, maybe even a little bit more than that. There's some deviation there. So let's now talk about compatibility. Can I shoot 7.62 by 54, for instance, in, let's say, a Finnish M2830 rifle, which has the 7.62 by 53 millimeter original chambering with a 308 diameter bore? Maybe you could, but we have to answer a couple questions here. First of all, is it safe to? Now, I can never answer a question, is your gun safe to shoot? Only a gunsmith can answer that. Now, I can speak to it from a plausibility standpoint, right? Is it likely that it's going to be a safety hazard to shoot it? Well, from everything I've studied, it's very unlikely that there's going to be some sort of safety hazard from shooting commercial ammo through a 2830. If you're going to do it, again, have a gunsmith run this idea by a gunsmith first, but you obviously want to find the smallest diameter projectiles you could. And even the best thing to do would just be to hand load your own 54 cartridges, assuming that neck length isn't going to cause issues. It helps to see if you can actually chamber a 54 millimeter cartridge first before you try to hand load it. But if you can find some 308 diameter bullets to reload in your 54 millimeter cartridges, that's going to probably be your best bet. Now, Finland, almost certainly at times had troops utilizing captured Russian 7.62 by 54 millimeter ammo through some of their barrels that had a .308 diameter. It seems like this was only recommended to do in emergency situations, though. They were always told, whatever ammo you have on hand, always utilize your 7.62x53 first, and then only try to use 7.62x54 in your rifles in an emergency situation, i.e. if you have no other ammo. So obviously Finland permitted it, so it probably didn't pose any imminent danger, probably, but they also didn't recommend doing it. Now, what are going to be some of the pitfalls of doing this? Well, when we're talking about shooting, let's say a .311 or .312 diameter bullet through a .308 diameter bore, you're going to cause some overpressuring. And overpressuring is never a good thing. It's also going to cause excess wear and accelerate the wear on the rifling. So there's really, from an aspect of today, there's really no good reason to do that. And that's my perspective as a historian. I just don't see the need to take one of these really cool old Finnish rifles and shoot a bunch of commercial ammo. Now, some of them I have, like that M24 I mentioned earlier. That one's already really, really worn, and honestly, the bore's probably opened up anyway. So that one worked, and it is what it is. But, you know, one that's in really nice shape, there's really no need to. And if you want to shoot, if you really want to shoot it, which I'm a historian, I don't generally shoot the rifles as much as a lot of other people do that watch these channels who are into that type of thing. Just hand load, get some reloading dies and try to get some .308 diameter projectiles. There's a lot of info on doing this on the internet, and you should be set. But again, I can never tell you that your particular gun is safe to shoot because every gun's a little bit different. And that's why, again, always have a gunsmith take a look at your rifle. They can tell you if the safety of shooting your rifle, and they can tell you the optimal bullet size to use for reloading. So it's really handy. And well, we need more gunsmiths and we need to support them. So go support your local gunsmith with your Mosin project. Okay, so it probably doesn't pose a imminent safety concern, likely, given what I know as a historian. But there's one other thing we need to talk about from a safety perspective, because I can't tell you how many times I've heard this once or twice, someone say, this is basically gun show lore. Oh, the Mosin Nagant's a split breech receiver, and it's not as strong as a Mauser receiver. I'm like, okay, well, in theory, I guess that kind of makes sense, right? You don't have a piece back here connecting your receiver together, so technically it's an inherently weaker design. If we're going to talk about the weakness of the action, though, we need a little bit more context. Generally speaking, I would say the Mosin Nagant is not a weak action in the slightest. Again, every gun's different, though. Yeah, I'm going to go back to check with your local gunsmith again. But this gets interesting because what I recommend you do is go watch one of IV8888's old, like 10-year-old Mosin torture test videos where he takes a Mosin and shoots a cartridge hand-loaded with range trash powder. Now what that is a bunch of random unburnt rifle and pistol powder picked up from a range, and he basically filled, as I recall, the entire, this was not a good idea, the entire cartridge basically to the top with this range trash, and then put a bullet on top of it and then fired it. And the gun didn't explode. It didn't explode. It was basically unusable because there was so much pressure that the bolt handle actually got sort of bent back and overcame the lug on the bolt, so there was actually no way to unlock the receiver, or unlock the action, I guess is a better way to say that. So the gun was basically worthless, but it held. Like, it didn't explode. And after I saw that, I realized, you know, that was a wartime, maybe a pre-war, but, you know, 1930s, 1940s, 9130 looked like a round receiver, which, you know, I've also heard that story that round receivers aren't as strong as hex receivers. It's like, well, okay, I mean, maybe theoretically, but in what meaningful context can we actually put that? And I can't really find one. If that gun didn't explode using range trash. Now, I'm not saying do that. Don't do that. And I'm also not saying that it's wise to shoot 7.62 by 54 through a Mosin with a 308 diameter bore. It's not really wise. But there's also one other really weird, interesting thing from history that we need to look at for reference. So let's do that now. This is, well, another Mosin. However, this isn't just any Mosin. This is probably one of the sketchiest Mosins, military Mosins, certainly not any Mosin, but sketchiest military Mosin that probably has maybe ever existed. What we have here is an M91 from World War I. This one was made by the Ijevs factory in 1909, except it's a little bit different and harbors a very strange and dark secret. You see, it's got this weird splicing up here. This one was actually adjusted in Romania, probably during the Cold War. So this guy has been places. However, what's interesting about this rifle, and the reason that I'm showing it to you today is, well, it kind of takes what we were talking about to the extreme. You see, this rifle was actually captured by the Austro-Hungarians in World War I and was then subsequently sent to OEWG Steyr in Austria. And OEWG Steyr rechambered this rifle for the 8x50 millimeter rimmed Austrian cartridge. And so you might say, well, that's interesting, but how does this really pertain to our conversation today? Well, remember, this is harboring a dark secret. The dark secret is that in the Austro-Hungarians' infinite wisdom, they decided that they didn't need to re-rifle these guns, many of them, this one included. And so what we actually have here is, well, nothing short of an atrocity. This is a 7.62 by 54 millimeter gun chambered in an 8 millimeter cartridge. So the bore diameter is still the same, and it's actually, I don't know, it seems pretty decent. Actually, it's kind of terrifying. Bore diameter, again, is probably somewhere between 311 to 314 when it was new. Could have opened up a little bit by now. Seems like this gun probably hasn't been shot that much. I could understand why. However, the bullet that this is chambered for is actually, it depends on who you talk to. It seems like it was anywhere from a .321 to a .323 diameter projectile. And OEWG Steyr did that. Yeah, apparently the Austro-Hungarians, through their testing, realized that the Mosin action was strong enough to where you could shoot a .321-ish bullet through a .312 or 3-ish bore fine. Again, I mean, I'm not a gunsmith, I'm a historian, but I can look at this and say, this seems a little bit more sketchy than trying to shoot 7.62 by 54 through a 308 diameter bore in a Finnish Mosin. Neither of these things is really a great idea. But again, I can only show you history, what was done, and it seemed like it worked, I guess. Although I don't know how much these things are actually shot. I'm not shooting this gun, that I can tell you. In fact, I don't know how this managed to get past the Romanian armories through the Cold War. It'll chamber its 8x50 rimmed cartridge just fine. So they didn't rechamber this or anything. I don't know how this got past them, but I suspect perhaps alcohol and drugs maybe were involved. I don't really know. This thing's kind of a unicorn and it's kind of scary. But I wanted to bring this out to show y'all just some of the weird stuff that was done historically, so I can tell you in theory, you know, it's probably okay in theory as a historian. If I was a gunsmith, though, which I'm not, I may have a whole nother story to tell you. But I can tell you, trying to shoot larger diameter bullets through significantly smaller diameter bores is just not really a good idea. So I don't think anything more needs to be said there. So I really hope this video was helpful to some of y'all in understanding what is 7.62 by 53 millimeter rimmed. And a lot of people may not have even realized that Finnish Mosins are technically chambered for a different caliber altogether than 54R. And hopefully a lot of y'all, maybe all this technical talk about bullets and bore diameters and stuff, maybe it'll get some of y'all, especially some of the younger crowd, interested in reloading. That is always a big plus because we need more reloaders and hand loaders in our younger generations for sure. I'm not much of a hand loader myself, but if you have questions, I can try to find someone I can link you to that has much better info than me on those topics. And you can search YouTube. There's plenty of good info on hand loaders, especially for Mosins. People have been doing that for years, thankfully. So, moral of the story is Finnish Mosins are pretty cool, and if you want a really good shooter and you want to shoot commercial ammo through a Finnish Mosin, your best bet is going to probably be one of those M39s we were looking at. Although remember, the M39 at a 310 diameter bore still has a slightly smaller bore diameter than even Russian commercial ammo. So keep that in mind as well. Moral of the story, I guess, is Finnish Mosins, if you really want to shoot them, hand loading is by far going to be your best way to get the best accuracy and reduce the amount of pressure and wear on your gun. All right, so thank you guys for watching. I really hope you learned something and enjoyed this deep dive into cartridges and all the interesting gory details. If you want to look at some of the neat rifles we've taken a look at today, you can see some of them on mosinmuseum.com under our models page. We're constantly working on that website, adding stuff. There's not a whole lot of content yet, but we are constantly working to add a lot more stuff, and I appreciate y'all's suggestions and feedback. Let me know if you guys have any prayer requests, and we'll see you next time.